Lower, the Duchess said again, and the whole ballroom went quiet enough to hear the candles burning. Elena Whitmore's knee hovered an inch above the polished floor, her back already aching from holding the curtsy so long, and still Duchess Constance Ravenswood was not satisfied. Lower, she repeated, her voice sweet as poison, and 200 guests turned to watch a girl in a borrowed blue dress fold herself smaller and smaller under the chandeliers of Ashcombe Manor. Elena had walked into that ballroom only minutes before, her heart light with an invitation she still could not quite believe. She had never expected to see the inside of a duke's home, let alone be greeted by name at the door. But the moment Duchess Constance's eyes found her across the room, the warmth of the evening had curdled into something colder, something watchful. Constance had crossed the floor with the unhurried elegance of a woman who never needed to rush because she always got what she wanted, and by the time she reached Elena, her smile was already a blade. "You must be the seamstress's daughter," Constance had said, loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. "How generous of someone to let you borrow that dress. It suits you almost as well as it must have suited its owner." Elena had felt her face go hot, but she said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was safer than defending herself in rooms like this one, rooms built for people who had never had to earn anything they owned. She dropped into a curtsy, the proper depth, the correct angle, exactly as her mother had taught her for the rare occasions when manners mattered more than pride. It was not enough for Constance. "Lower," the Duchess had said the first time, and a ripple of surprised laughter moved through the nearest guests, the kind of laughter people give when they are relieved the cruelty is not aimed at them. Elena had bent further, confused, glancing up to see if this was some strange custom of grand houses she did not know. But Constance's eyes were bright with something that was not tradition. It was hunger. It was the particular pleasure of a woman who had found someone smaller than herself to press down upon, if only for a moment, in front of witnesses who would remember it. "Lower," the Duchess commanded a second time, and this time no one laughed. The silence that followed was heavier, more uncertain. Somewhere near the string quartet, a violin bow stopped moving mid-note. A young man in scarlet regimental dress lowered his glass of wine without drinking from it. Even the footmen along the wall, trained to remain invisible, allowed themselves to glance toward the center of the room. Elena's legs trembled. She was not a proud woman by nature, not someone who needed to be admired or praised, but there was a difference between humility and humiliation, and she understood now, with sickening clarity, that the Duchess intended the second. This was not a test of manners. It was a public unmaking, staged for an audience, designed to remind every servant and every guest of modest birth exactly where they stood in a house like this one. She thought of her mother, waiting up at their small rented rooms above the dressmaker's shop, proud that her daughter had been invited somewhere so grand. She thought of the letter that had arrived a week earlier, sealed with the Ashcombe crest, inviting her by name to a ball she had no right to attend by rank alone. She thought, strangely, of the stranger she had helped on the road outside the village 3 weeks before. A man in plain traveling clothes whose carriage wheel had broken in the mud. A man she had helped without knowing or caring who he was. She did not think of him now as anyone who could help her. She only thought that she must not cry, not here, not in front of all these watching eyes. Her knee dropped another fraction of an inch. Whispers moved through the crowd like wind through wheat. Somewhere, a woman murmured that this had gone far enough, but no one moved to stop it, because stopping a duchess in her own ballroom was not something anyone present was prepared to risk. And then, before her knee could touch the marble floor, a hand closed gently but firmly around her own. She looked up, startled, and found herself looking into the face of the man from the road. Except he was not dressed as he had been that day, in plain brown traveling clothes with mud on his boots. Tonight he wore the deep blue coat and silver buttons of a man of the highest rank in the room, and the guests who had been whispering fell utterly silent, because the man lifting Elena Whitmore to her feet was Alistair Ashcombe, the Duke himself, and no one in that ballroom had ever seen him move so quickly across a room in his life. "There will be no more curtsying tonight," he said, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the vast room. "Not from her, and not to please anyone's idea of where she belongs." Constance's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time that evening, the sweetness drained from her expression, replaced by something sharper, something almost frightened. as though she had misjudged not Elena, but the ground she was standing on. "Alistair," she said carefully, "this is simply a matter of proper form. The girl is a guest of uncertain station. Surely you understand that certain customs exist to maintain order." The Duke did not look at his cousin. He kept his eyes on Elena, who stood frozen, her hand still resting in his, unsure whether she was meant to pull away or hold on. There was warmth in his gaze, and something else too, something that looked almost like relief, as though he had been searching a crowded room for a familiar face, and had finally found it. "I know exactly what customs exist in this house," he said at last, turning now to address Constance, and to address, by extension, everyone else listening. "And I know precisely how they are sometimes used, not to maintain order, but to remind certain people that they were never meant to belong here at all. I will not have it, not under my roof, and not in my name." A murmur swept the ballroom, too quiet to be called a gasp, but too loud to be called silence. Guests exchanged glances. Somewhere near the refreshment table, an elderly woman raised her fan to hide a small, satisfied smile, as though she had waited years to see Constance Ravenswood put in her place. Elena, for her part, felt the room tilt strangely around her, as if she had stepped from one story into another without warning. Only moments before, she had been folding herself smaller and smaller, trying to disappear into the floor rather than draw further attention. Now every eye in the room was fixed on her. But the weight of those eyes had changed entirely. It was no longer the weight of judgment. It was the weight of curiosity, of surprise, of something that might, in time, become respect. She managed, finally, to find her voice. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "you do not need to trouble yourself on my account. I did not mean to cause a disturbance." "You caused no disturbance," the Duke said, his tone softening only for her, though everyone could still hear him. "The disturbance was caused before you ever arrived tonight, by people who forgot that kindness does not ask about rank before it acts." Constance's composure, which had held remarkably well through the first exchange, finally cracked at the edges. "You cannot mean to defend her," she said, her voice rising just enough to betray her. "Alistair, think of what people will say. Think of your position, of your family's name." "I am thinking of exactly that," the Duke replied, and for the first time that evening his voice carried an edge that made even the footmen along the wall straighten. "My family's name has stood for generations on the principle that a title means responsibility, not entitlement to cruelty. If people wish to speak of tonight, let them speak of a duchess who tried to break a stranger in front of 200 witnesses, and a young woman who bent but did not break." Elena felt her cheeks color, not with shame this time but with something closer to astonishment. No one had ever spoken about her that way before, certainly not in a room full of silk gowns and diamond pins. She was aware, distantly, of the orchestra beginning to play again, softly, as though the musicians had decided the moment needed something to fill the silence rather than deepen it. She was aware of Constance turning sharply on her heel and moving toward the far doors, her skirts snapping like a closing fan, trailed by two ladies who seemed uncertain whether to follow her or stay and watch what happened next. "Are you unharmed?" the Duke asked quietly, once the immediate crowd had begun, slowly, to return to their own conversations, their own dances, their own small dramas that suddenly seemed far less interesting than the one that had just unfolded before them. "I am," Elena said, though her voice shook slightly. "I only wish I understood why any of this happened at all. I have never met the Duchess before tonight. I have done nothing to earn her anger." "You have done something far more dangerous than earning her anger," the Duke said, guiding her gently away from the center of the room, toward a quieter alcove near a tall window that looked out over the dark gardens. "You have earned my attention, and my gratitude, and my cousin's wife has decided that both of those things belong to her alone, regardless of whether I have ever offered them." Elena studied his face in the candlelight, trying to reconcile the plainly dressed traveler she remembered from the muddy road, with the composed, commanding figure standing beside her now. "You are the man whose carriage broke down," she said slowly, as though testing the memory aloud to see if it still held true. "Near Hollow Bridge, 3 weeks ago. You told me your name was Alistair, nothing more." "Because nothing more seemed necessary at the time," he said, a small, private smile touching the corner of his mouth. "You did not ask for my rank before you helped me free the wheel from the mud. You did not ask whether I could reward you before you offered me the last of your bread and your own cloak against the rain. I have met a great many people in my life who wanted something from me the moment they learned my name. You wanted nothing at all. I wanted only to help someone who needed it, Elena said simply. That is not something that requires a title to understand. No, the Duke agreed. His voice quiet now, meant only for her. It does not. Which is precisely why I could not stand by and watch you lowered to the floor tonight, as though your worth depended on the shape of your bow. Around them, the ball continued, glittering and loud, but Elena felt strangely separate from it now, as though she and the Duke stood together in a small pocket of stillness, while the rest of the room spun on without them. She was aware of curious glances thrown their way, whispered questions passed from guest to guest, speculation already beginning to bloom like something dangerous and fast-growing. She did not know, in that moment, what any of it would mean for her in the days to come. She did not know that Duchess Constance, standing rigid and furious near the far doors, was already turning over plans far more dangerous than a public command to Curtsy. She did not know that the simple kindness she had shown a stranger on a muddy road would follow her, for better and for worse, through every room she entered from that night forward. She knew only that her knees no longer trembled, that her back had straightened without her deciding to straighten it, and that for the first time since walking through the doors of Ashcombe Manor, she felt as though she were standing on solid ground. "Thank you," she said softly, "for what you did tonight. I do not know how I can repay such kindness." "You owe me nothing," the Duke said. "If anything, the debt runs the other way, and has since the day you helped a stranger who could offer you nothing in return. Tonight I have simply begun to pay a small part of it back." Behind them, unnoticed by either, Duchess Constance watched from the shadow of a marble column. Her fan snapped shut in her gloved hand, her eyes narrow and calculating. Whatever softness had lived in her expression earlier that evening was gone entirely now, replaced by something colder, something patient. She had lost this round in front of witnesses, and that humiliation burned in her chest like a coal. But the night was young, and the season had only just begun, and Constance Ravenswood was not a woman who accepted defeat easily, nor one who forgot it quickly. She would find another way. She always did. For now, though, the ballroom glittered on, the music swelled, and Elena Whitmore stood beside a duke who had crossed a crowded room for her, unaware that the true trouble of the evening had not ended with a lifted hand and a silenced room, but had only just begun to gather its strength in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. Word of what had happened in the ballroom spread through Ashcombe Manor faster than any servant could carry a tray. By the time the musicians took their first rest of the evening, nearly every guest in the house had heard some version of the story, each one slightly different, each one growing a little more dramatic with every retelling. Some said the Duke had struck his cousin's wife across the face. Others said Elena Whitmore was secretly the daughter of a foreign nobleman, hidden away for her own protection. None of these stories were true, but Elena would learn, in the days that followed, that truth rarely mattered as much as the story people preferred to believe. She sat now in a small drawing room near the eastern wing of the manor, where the Duke's aunt, Lady Margaret Ashcombe, had gently steered her after the commotion in the ballroom had begun to settle. Lady Margaret was a tall woman, with silver hair and a face that had clearly once been striking, though age had softened its edges into something kinder, something more watchful. She poured tea with steady hands, and studied Elena over the rim of her own cup, as though trying to solve a puzzle that had been placed unexpectedly on her doorstep. "You handled yourself with more grace than most women twice your age would have managed," Lady Margaret said finally, setting down her cup. "I have watched my nephew's cousin humiliate a great many people over the years, always with that same sweet voice, always in front of an audience large enough to make the humiliation sting. I have never once seen anyone stand as still and as steady as you did tonight." "I did not feel steady," Elena admitted. "I felt as though the floor might open beneath me at any moment." "That is precisely what steadiness looks like from the outside," Lady Margaret said with a small, knowing smile. "No one who has truly mastered calm ever feels calm on the inside. They simply refuse to let anyone else see the storm." Elena wrapped her hands around her own teacup, grateful for its warmth. She could still feel the echo of the ballroom's silence pressing against her ears, the weight of 200 pairs of eyes, the particular sharpness of the Duchess's voice repeating that single word. She wondered how many other young women had heard that same command over the years, how many had bent all the way to the floor rather than risk the consequences of refusing. "May I ask you something, Lady Margaret?" Elena said carefully. "Why does the Duchess dislike me so much? I have never met her before tonight. I have never done anything to offend her." Lady Margaret considered the question for a long moment before answering. "It is not you she dislikes, dear girl," she said at last. "It is the possibility you represent. Constance has spent 3 years maneuvering herself and her family closer to my nephew, hoping that proximity might eventually become something more permanent. She has never openly declared her intentions, because Alistair has never given her the slightest encouragement. But hope of that particular kind does not require encouragement to grow. It only requires the absence of a stronger claim." "And you believe I am a stronger claim?" Elena asked, startled by the suggestion. "I believe," Lady Margaret said carefully, "that my nephew crossed a crowded ballroom faster than I have seen him move in years, in front of every important family in the county, to lift a stranger to her feet. Whatever that means, Constance clearly understood it before the rest of us did, and she did not care for what she understood." Elena sat with that thought in uncomfortable silence. She had not come to Ashcombe Manor seeking anyone's attention, least of all the Duke's. She had come because an invitation had arrived, sealed with a crest she did not recognize until her mother explained its significance, and because refusing such an invitation seemed both impossible and unwise. She had certainly never imagined that her presence alone might threaten the ambitions of a duchess. "Perhaps I should not have come tonight," she said quietly. "It seems my presence has caused nothing but trouble." Lady Margaret reached across the small table and covered Elena's hand with her own, a gesture that felt surprisingly warm coming from a woman Elena had met only an hour before. "Do not mistake trouble for wrongdoing," she said firmly. "You caused no trouble tonight. You simply existed in a room where certain people preferred you did not. Those are very different things, and I would encourage you to remember the difference, because you may need to remind yourself of it again before this season ends." Before Elena could respond, the door to the drawing room opened, and the Duke himself stepped inside, his earlier composure somewhat restored, but his eyes still carrying a trace of the tension from the ballroom. He glanced first at his aunt, then at Elena, and something in his shoulders eased slightly at the sight of her sitting calmly with a cup of tea, rather than fleeing the manor entirely, which Lady Margaret suspected he had half feared she might do. "I hope my aunt has not been interrogating you," he said, attempting lightness though his voice still carried an edge of concern. "I have been doing precisely that," Lady Margaret said without apology, rising from her chair and smoothing her skirts. "And I have found her answers far more sensible than anything I have heard from you in the last hour, nephew. I will leave the two of you to speak. I imagine there is a great deal to discuss, and very little of it is my business." She left the room with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood exactly when her presence was no longer needed, closing the door softly behind her. The Duke remained standing near the entrance for a moment, as though uncertain whether to take the chair his aunt had vacated, or to keep a respectful distance. Elena, watching him hesitate, felt an unexpected surge of sympathy. For all his composure in the ballroom, for all the authority in his voice when he had silenced his own cousin, in front of 200 witnesses, he seemed almost uncertain now, almost young, standing in a quiet room with nothing but the truth to offer. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I imagine we are both still recovering from tonight, in our own ways." He sat, though he perched at the edge of the chair rather than settling into it, as though he might need to rise again at a moment's notice. "I owe you an apology," he began. "You owe me nothing of the kind," Elena interrupted gently. "You did nothing tonight, except stop something cruel from continuing. If anyone owes an apology, it is not you. Perhaps not for tonight specifically," he admitted, "but for the position I have placed you in, simply by inviting you here. I knew, when I sent that invitation, that certain people would question why a duke was extending such an honor to a seamstress's daughter he had met only once, under circumstances no one else witnessed. I told myself the risk was small, that people would assume it was a simple act of gratitude and nothing more. I did not anticipate that Constance would respond the way she did, and for that miscalculation, I am genuinely sorry." Elena studied him for a long moment, trying to reconcile his words with the man who had commanded an entire ballroom into silence only an hour before. There was something disarming about hearing him speak so plainly, without the polish and performance she had expected from someone of his rank. She thought again of the muddy road outside Hollow Bridge, of the quiet, unassuming traveler who had thanked her so sincerely for a torn strip of cloak and a heel of bread, never once mentioning who he truly was. "May I ask you something honestly?" she said. "Always," he replied. "Why did you invite me at all? You could have sent money, or a gift, or simply forgotten the entire incident once your carriage was repaired, and you continued on your way. Instead, you sent an invitation sealed with your family crest, to a ball attended by the most important families in the county. That is not the behavior of a man simply settling a small debt of gratitude." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the dark shapes of the garden hedges were just visible against the night sky. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier formality, replaced by something more careful, more considered. "I have spent a great deal of my life surrounded by people who wanted something from me," he said slowly. "Land, title, connection, influence. I have grown accustomed to weighing every kindness shown to me against the possibility that it conceals some hidden request. When my carriage broke down that day, and a young woman I had never met stopped to help me without asking a single question about who I was or what I could offer her in return, it struck me as something I had not encountered in a very long time. I did not invite you tonight to settle a debt. I invited you because I wanted to see you again, and because I could think of no honest way to arrange that meeting, except through an invitation that could not easily be refused or questioned." Elena felt her cheeks warm, though this time, the heat had nothing to do with shame. "That is a very different explanation than I expected," she admitted. "I imagine it is a very different explanation than my cousin's wife expected as well," he said, a faint, rueful smile touching his mouth, which is likely why she reacted as she did. "Do you believe she will simply accept tonight's events and move on?" Elena asked, unable to keep a note of worry from her voice. "Lady Margaret suggested she is not a woman who forgives easily. My aunt is rarely wrong about people," the Duke admitted. "I do not expect Constance to simply accept what happened tonight, and I would be lying if I told you I was not concerned about what she might attempt next. But I would rather face whatever comes with honesty than continue pretending an invitation was nothing more than simple gratitude. You deserve better than half-truths, especially after everything you endured tonight on my account." Outside the drawing room, the sounds of the ball continued, music and laughter and the low murmur of conversation drifting faintly through the closed door, a reminder that the wider world had not paused simply because two people sat quietly discussing truths they had both, until tonight, kept carefully hidden. Elena thought of her mother, waiting at home, who would want to hear every detail of the evening, and would likely find this particular detail the most astonishing of all. She thought of the seamstress's shop where she had spent so many hours stitching hems for women who would never learn her name, and how strange it felt now to sit in a grand manner being told, by a duke, that her kindness had been remembered and valued above every title in the room. "I do not know what any of this means," she said finally, honestly. "I did not come here tonight expecting anything beyond a single evening I could tell my mother about for years to come. I am not certain I know how to navigate whatever this has become." "Neither am I," the Duke admitted, and there was something almost boyish in the confession, something that made Elena like him more than she had expected to. "But I would rather navigate it honestly, one step at a time, than pretend tonight never happened and allow Constance to believe her cruelty went unanswered." They sat together a while longer, the conversation gradually softening into easier territory. Questions about her work at the dressmaker's shop, stories about his years managing the estate, small observations about the guests still dancing beyond the closed door. It was, Elena thought, the strangest and most unexpected evening of her life, and yet sitting there in the quiet drawing room, she felt none of the fear that had gripped her in the ballroom only an hour before. Whatever storm Duchess Constance was gathering somewhere in the shadows of Ashcombe Manor, it had not yet reached this small, quiet room, and for now, that was enough. But storms, as Elena would soon learn, rarely announce themselves before they arrive. 3 days after the ball, Elena stood behind the counter of Mrs. Hargrove's dressmaking shop, pinning a hem for a customer who could not stop asking questions about the rumors sweeping through town. It seemed the entire county had heard some version of what happened at Ashcombe Manor, and everyone, it appeared, had an opinion about what it meant. "Is it true the Duke declared his affection for you in front of the whole ballroom?" the customer asked. A woman named Mrs. Colby, who ran the bakery 2 streets over, and had never in her life managed to keep a secret for longer than an hour. "He did no such thing," Elena said patiently, keeping her eyes on the pins in her hand. "He simply stopped his cousin's wife from behaving unkindly toward a guest. That is all that happened." "That is not what I heard," Mrs. Colby said, clearly disappointed by the plain version of events. "I heard he lifted you from the floor and declared before everyone that you were the finest woman he had ever met." Elena bit back a sigh and finished pinning the hem in silence, letting the woman's imagination fill in whatever gaps her own restraint left behind. She had grown used to this in the days since the ball, the way each retelling of that single evening grew a little more elaborate, a little further from what had actually happened. She did not entirely blame the people repeating these stories. A duke defending a seamstress's daughter against his own cousin's wife was, by any measure, an unusual event, the kind that naturally invited embellishment. But the embellishments made her uneasy all the same, because they drew more attention to her than she had ever wanted, and attention, she had learned quickly, was not always kind. Her mother, working at the table near the back window, glanced up with a knowing look but said nothing, until Mrs. Colby had paid for her alterations and left the shop, the bell above the door jingling cheerfully behind her. "You will need to grow accustomed to that," her mother said gently, returning to her own stitching. "People will always prefer an exciting story to a plain truth, especially when the plain truth involves someone as important as the Duke of Ashcombe." "I do not want to be the subject of anyone's story," Elena said, setting down her pins with more force than necessary. "I only wanted to attend one ball and return to my ordinary life afterward. Instead, I cannot walk to the market without someone asking whether I am to become a duchess." Her mother's needle paused mid-stitch. "And what would you say if someone asked you plainly whether that was something you wanted?" Elena opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, uncertain. In truth, she had asked herself the same question more than once since the night of the ball, lying awake in the small room she shared with her mother above the shop, staring at the ceiling and turning over every word the Duke had spoken to her in that quiet drawing room. She thought of his honesty, his willingness to admit uncertainty rather than hide behind practiced charm. And she thought too of the warning in Lady Margaret's voice when she had spoken of Duchess Constance's ambitions. Whatever she wanted for herself, she understood clearly that wanting it would not be simple, and might not even be safe. "I do not know," she admitted finally. "I know only that I do not wish to be anyone's excuse for cruelty, whether that cruelty comes from a duchess who resents me, or from a town full of people who cannot stop inventing stories about a night that has already ended." Her mother set down her own work and reached across the table, taking Elena's hand much as Lady Margaret had done 3 nights before. "Nights end, dear one," she said softly, "but the people in them do not simply disappear because the candles have been put out. If the Duke's attention toward you was genuine, it will not vanish simply because a few days have passed without word from him. And if it was not genuine, better to learn that now than to build hopes on something that was never solid to begin with." Elena nodded, though the words offered less comfort than her mother likely intended. She had received no word from Ashcombe Manor in the 3 days since the ball, no letter, no visit, nothing beyond the wild rumors circulating through the town. Part of her told herself this silence was reasonable. A duke could not simply call upon a seamstress's daughter without inviting exactly the kind of speculation she was already struggling to escape. But another part of her, quieter and more honest, wondered whether the warmth she had felt in that drawing room had already faded once the excitement of the evening passed, replaced by the practical considerations of rank and reputation that governed men of his position. She was still turning these thoughts over when the bell above the shop door rang again, and she looked up, expecting another curious customer eager for gossip. Instead, she found herself facing a young woman she did not recognize, dressed simply but well, with dark hair pulled back beneath a plain bonnet and an expression that seemed to carry both nervousness and determination in equal measure. "I am looking for Elena Whitmore," the young woman said, glancing between Elena and her mother as though uncertain which of them she addressed. "I am Elena," she said, setting down her work and stepping closer to the counter. The young woman glanced quickly toward the shop window, as though checking whether anyone outside might be watching, before lowering her voice. "My name is Charlotte Bennet. I work in the household of Duchess Constance Ravenswood, as a lady's maid. I have come here on my own, without anyone's knowledge, because I believe there is something you should know, and I did not trust it to a letter that might be intercepted. Elena felt a cold ripple of unease move through her chest. Please, she said, gesturing toward a quieter corner of the shop, away from the front window. Tell me what has brought you here. Charlotte glanced once more toward the door before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. Since the night of the ball, the Duchess has been in a fury unlike anything I have seen from her in the 2 years I have served in her household. She has spoken privately, more than once, of finding a way to remove you from the Duke's favor before the season progresses any further. I do not know the full details of her plan, because she is careful to say little in front of the servants, but I have overheard enough to understand that she intends to damage your reputation in some way that cannot easily be undone. Elena's mother, who had followed silently and now stood close beside her daughter, spoke with quiet urgency. What kind of damage does she intend, exactly? I cannot say with certainty, Charlotte admitted, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. But I have heard her mention a name, a man named Edmund Fairweather, who is known in certain circles for spreading stories about people he has never met. Stories that are difficult to disprove once they have taken hold. I believe she intends to use him somehow, perhaps to suggest something improper about your character, or about the nature of your acquaintance with the Duke before the ball ever took place. Elena felt her stomach tighten with dread. She thought immediately of the road outside Hollow Bridge, of the innocent hour she had spent helping a stranger repair his carriage wheel, an encounter that had felt, at the time, like nothing more than simple kindness offered to someone in need. She could imagine, all too easily, how such an innocent meeting might be twisted into something scandalous, in the hands of someone determined to ruin her. Why are you telling me this? Elena asked, studying Charlotte's face carefully. You risk your position, perhaps far worse, by coming here to warn a stranger. Charlotte's expression hardened slightly, a flash of something fierce passing behind her nervousness. Because I have watched Duchess Constance treat people cruelly for 2 years, and I have said nothing, because I needed the position and could not afford to lose it. But what she did to you in that ballroom, in front of 200 people, was different. It was not simply unkindness. It was an attempt to break someone in public, for no reason beyond her own wounded pride. I could not, in good conscience, remain silent while she attempted something even worse behind closed doors. Elena reached out and took Charlotte's hand, grateful beyond words for the risk this stranger had taken on her behalf. Thank you, she said sincerely. I do not know how I can repay this kindness, but I will not forget it. You can repay it, Charlotte said, managing a small, tired smile, by being careful. Trust very few people in the coming weeks, and be certain that anything you say or do in public can withstand being twisted by someone determined to see the worst in it. I must return to the manor before I am missed, but I will send word again if I learn anything further. After Charlotte left, disappearing quickly back into the busy street outside, Elena stood in stunned silence for several long moments, her mind racing through the implications of what she had just learned. Her mother, ever practical even in moments of crisis, was already moving toward the small writing desk near the back of the shop, retrieving paper and ink. We must send word to the Duke, her mother said firmly. He deserves to know what his cousin's wife is planning, and you deserve his protection against whatever scheme she intends to set in motion. I do not wish to appear as though I am seeking his protection for my own advantage, Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized how impractical they sounded, given the danger Charlotte had just described. Elena, her mother said, her voice firmer than Elena had heard it in years, there is a difference between pride and foolishness. A woman is planning to destroy your reputation through lies spread by a man paid to spread them. This is not the moment to worry about how your caution might appear to others. This is the moment to protect yourself by whatever honest means are available to you. Elena knew her mother was right, though the knowledge did little to ease the tight knot of anxiety in her chest. She thought of the warmth in the Duke's voice when he had spoken to her in the quiet drawing room, the honesty of his admission that he had wanted to see her again. She wanted desperately to believe that warmth was strong enough to withstand whatever lies Duchess Constance intended to spread, but she had also seen, in the ballroom 3 nights before, exactly how quickly a room full of respectable people could turn against someone, simply because a woman with a title decided they should. As her mother began composing a careful letter to be delivered to Ashcombe Manor, Elena moved to the shop window and looked out at the street beyond, watching the ordinary rhythm of the town continue as though nothing had changed. Somewhere beyond the rooftops, in the grand rooms of Ashcombe Manor, Duchess Constance was setting some scheme into motion, patient and calculating, determined to finish what she had started in that ballroom 3 nights before. Elena did not yet know the shape that scheme would take, or how quickly it would arrive, but she understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest, that the quiet peace of the last 3 days had been nothing more than the stillness before a storm. The letter reached Ashcombe Manor before nightfall, carried by a boy from the village whom Elena's mother trusted to deliver it directly into the hands of the household steward. By the following morning, a response arrived, not in the form of a letter, but in the form of the Duke himself, arriving at the small dressmaking shop in a plain carriage, without any of the crests or decoration that usually marked his family's transportation. A deliberate choice, Elena realized, meant to avoid drawing attention to his visit. He entered the shop quietly, removing his hat as he stepped through the door, and for a moment, Mrs. Hargrove, the shop owner, simply stared at him in open astonishment, before remembering her manners and hurrying to offer him the best chair available, which he politely declined, in favor of standing near the counter where Elena worked. "I received your mother's letter," he said without preamble, his voice low and urgent. "Tell me everything Charlotte Bennet shared with you. I need to understand exactly what Constance intends before she has the chance to set it fully in motion." Elena set down her sewing and led him toward the quieter corner of the shop, where Charlotte had spoken to her the previous day, and recounted every detail she could remember: the mention of a man named Edmund Fairweather, the suggestion that Constance intended to twist the innocent encounter on the road outside Hollow Bridge into something scandalous, the warning that this scheme was meant to unfold quietly, without any obvious connection back to the Duchess herself. The Duke listened without interrupting, his expression growing progressively darker as she spoke, though his voice remained carefully controlled when he finally responded. "I know the name Fairweather," he said grimly. "He has been employed before by families seeking to damage reputations they find inconvenient, always working through intermediaries so that no direct connection can be proven. If Constance has indeed approached him, we must move quickly to counter whatever story he intends to spread, before it has the chance to take root." "What can we do?" Elena asked, feeling the familiar tightness of anxiety returning to her chest. "I have no power to stop a man like that from spreading whatever lies he chooses." "You are not without allies," the Duke said firmly. "My aunt has connections throughout the county that reach further than most people realize, and I myself am not without influence when it comes to protecting those under my care. But the most important thing we can do right now is ensure that when this story emerges, as I suspect it will very soon, there are enough people willing to speak the truth of what actually happened between us, that no fabrication can easily take hold." Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of doubt or hesitation, and found none. There was something steadying in his certainty, something that reminded her of the moment in the ballroom, when he had crossed the room to lift her from her knees without a single flicker of uncertainty in his expression. Whatever else might be said of Alistair Ashcombe, she was beginning to understand that he was not a man who abandoned people once he had decided to stand beside them. "There is something else you should know," he continued, his voice dropping lower still. "I have already spoken with my aunt this morning, before receiving your letter. She informed me that Constance requested an unusually large sum from the household accounts 3 days ago, shortly after the ball, an amount far beyond what any ordinary household expense would require. My aunt, who manages a great deal of the estate's finances in my absence, refused the request without my direct approval, which I have not given and do not intend to give. I believe that request was intended to pay Fairweather for exactly the kind of work Charlotte described." Elena felt a chill move through her at the confirmation, though some part of her had already suspected as much from the moment Charlotte first spoke Fairweather's name. "What will happen if the story spreads before we can stop it?" she asked quietly. "I do not have the standing to defend myself against a man skilled at making lies sound like truth." "You will not need to defend yourself alone," the Duke said, and there was something almost fierce in the way he said it, a determination that startled Elena with its intensity. "I intend to speak with several families of standing within the week, families whose word carries weight in this county, and explain to them plainly the circumstances of our acquaintance, and the nature of what happened in that ballroom. If Fairweather attempts to spread a different version of events, he will find himself contradicted by voices far more influential than his own, before his story has the chance to spread beyond a whisper. "Why would you go to such lengths for me?" Elena asked, unable to keep the question from escaping her lips. "You barely know me, beyond a single afternoon on a muddy road and a handful of conversations since." The Duke was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. "I have spent a great deal of my life watching people twist the truth to suit their own ambitions," he said finally. "My father did the same, more times than I care to admit, and I watched good people suffer for it, while he protected his own reputation instead of theirs. I promised myself, long before I ever met you, that if I ever held the power to prevent that kind of injustice, I would use it. You are not the first person I have tried to protect from cruelty dressed up as propriety, though I confess, you are the first for whom the effort has felt entirely personal." Elena felt her breath catch slightly at the honesty in his words, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the quiet shop around them fading into the background, as they simply looked at one another, two people who had met by accident on a muddy road, and found themselves, weeks later, standing together against a storm neither had chosen, but both now faced regardless. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of raised voices outside the shop, and moments later the door burst open to reveal a breathless young man Elena did not recognize, clearly a servant, judging by his plain livery, his face flushed from running. "Your Grace," he gasped, addressing the Duke directly, "forgive the intrusion, but Lady Margaret sent me at once. She said you must return to the manor immediately. A man has arrived, claiming to have information about a scandal involving yourself and Miss Whitmore, and he is already speaking with several of the guests who remained from the ball, gathering an audience before anyone thought to stop him." The Duke's face went pale, then hardened into something resolute. "Fairweather," he said grimly, more to himself than to anyone else in the room. "He has moved faster than I anticipated." Elena felt panic rising in her chest, but before she could speak, the Duke turned to her with a steadiness that helped anchor her own fear. "I must return to the manor at once," he said. "I want you to come with me, if you are willing. Whatever lies this man intends to spread, I would rather you stand beside me and hear them directly than wait here, imagining something even worse than the truth." Elena glanced at her mother, who nodded firmly, understanding without needing to be told that hiding from whatever awaited them would serve no purpose beyond delaying an inevitable confrontation. "I will come," Elena said, already reaching for her cloak. "I would rather face this directly than wonder, for even a single hour, what is being said about me in rooms I cannot enter." The carriage ride back to Ashcombe Manor felt impossibly long, though Elena knew later it could not have taken more than 20 minutes. She sat across from the Duke, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, running through every possible version of the lies that might already be spreading through the manor's drawing rooms. Beside her, the Duke remained largely silent, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the passing countryside, with an intensity that suggested he was rehearsing, in his mind, exactly how he intended to confront whatever awaited them. When they arrived, Lady Margaret met them at the door, her expression grave but composed. "He is in the eastern drawing room," she said without preamble, speaking of Fairweather, addressing several guests who chose to remain in the house today rather than return to their own estates. "I have managed to delay him somewhat by insisting he wait for tea to be served, but I do not know how much longer that delay will hold." "What has he claimed so far?" the Duke asked, already moving toward the eastern wing with long, purposeful strides that Elena struggled to match. "Nothing definitive yet," Lady Margaret said, keeping pace alongside them. "He has spoken only in suggestions and implications, the kind of talk that plants doubt without committing to a specific accusation that could later be disproven. He has hinted that Miss Whitmore's encounter with you on the road was not the accident it appeared to be, that there was some arrangement between them beforehand, though he has been careful not to state this outright." Elena's stomach twisted at the accusation, absurd as it was. The suggestion that her chance encounter with a stranded traveler had somehow been planned in advance struck her as almost laughable in its cruelty, and yet she understood, even as the thought crossed her mind, exactly how dangerous such an implication could become, once repeated enough times, by enough voices eager for scandal. They reached the drawing room just as Fairweather, A lean, sharp-featured man with an oily confidence that Elena disliked instantly, was mid-sentence, addressing a small circle of guests who leaned forward with the particular eagerness of people who suspected they were about to witness something scandalous. "Ah," Fairweather said, his eyes flicking toward the doorway with a satisfaction that made Elena's skin crawl. "Your Grace, and Miss Whitmore herself. How fortunate that you have arrived to join the conversation directly, rather than leaving me to speak of you both in your absence." The Duke stepped fully into the room, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every guest gathered there. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same unmistakable authority Elena had heard silence an entire ballroom 3 nights before. "I would be very interested, Mr. Fairweather," he said coldly, "to hear you repeat directly to my face whatever you have been suggesting to my guests in my absence." Fairweather's confidence flickered for only a moment before he recovered, settling his features into an expression of practiced innocence that Elena imagined he had used many times before, in rooms exactly like this one. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, "I have said nothing that was not already common knowledge among your guests. I have simply been discussing the rather unusual circumstances of your acquaintance with Miss Whitmore, circumstances that many people find curious, given how quickly it seems to have developed." "There is nothing curious about kindness offered to a stranger in need," the Duke replied, his voice cutting through the room with the same calm authority that had silenced the ballroom days before. "Miss Whitmore assisted me when my carriage broke down on the road outside Hollow Bridge, expecting nothing in return and asking no questions about my identity. That is the entirety of the story, and I am curious to know what version you have been sharing that requires such careful phrasing to avoid stating outright." "I have only repeated what I have heard from reliable sources," Fairweather said, though a thin sheen of sweat had begun to appear at his temple. "Sources who suggest the meeting on that road was arranged in advance, perhaps by Miss Whitmore herself, with the hope of securing exactly the kind of attention she has since received." A ripple of murmurs moved through the small gathered crowd, and Elena felt her face grow hot with anger rather than shame, a shift she noticed with some surprise. 3 days ago, an accusation like this might have crushed her into silence. Now, standing beside a man who had shown her plainly that her worth did not depend on the opinions of a room, she found herself unwilling to simply absorb the insult without response. "And who are these reliable sources?" Elena asked, stepping forward before the Duke could speak again, her voice steadier than she expected. "I would very much like to know the name of anyone who claims to have witnessed an arrangement that never took place." Fairweather's eyes flicked toward her, clearly surprised that she had chosen to address him directly, rather than remain silent while the Duke spoke on her behalf. "I am not at liberty to reveal my sources," he said carefully. "How convenient," Elena replied, "that sources whose identities cannot be revealed happen to support exactly the story someone appears determined to spread. Tell me, Mr. Fairweather, were you present on the road outside Hollow Bridge 3 weeks ago? Did you witness this arrangement you speak of with your own eyes?" "I was not present," Fairweather admitted, some of his earlier smoothness beginning to crack under the direct pressure of her questions. "Then you cannot know, with any certainty, whether what you are suggesting is true," Elena continued, her voice growing firmer with each word. "You are simply repeating whispers passed to you by someone with a clear interest in damaging my reputation and the Duke's, and presenting those whispers as though they carry the weight of fact." The room had gone quiet now, the small circle of guests watching the exchange with the same rapt attention they might have given a particularly gripping stage performance, though Elena was acutely aware that this was no performance at all, but a genuine fight for her own reputation, conducted in real time before an audience she had not chosen. "I merely report what I am told," Fairweather said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "I make no claims myself as to the truth of it." "Then perhaps you should reconsider your profession," the Duke said sharply, stepping forward now to stand beside Elena. "If the entirety of your work involves repeating unverified claims to damage the reputations of people who have done nothing to deserve it, I would ask you plainly, in front of these witnesses, who commissioned you to spread these particular rumors about Miss Whitmore and myself?" Fairweather's eyes darted toward the door, as though calculating whether he could escape the room before answering. But the Duke's presence, combined with the watchful eyes of the assembled guests, seemed to leave him little room to maneuver. "I was approached by someone within your own household, Your Grace," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was told the information was reliable, and that speaking of it would serve the interests of protecting your family's reputation from an unsuitable attachment." "Who approached you?" the Duke demanded, though something in his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Fairweather hesitated only a moment longer before the weight of the Duke's stare seemed to break whatever loyalty or fear had kept him silent. "Duchess Constance Ravenswood," he said finally, and the words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shocked murmurs through the assembled guests. A voice rose from the doorway before the Duke could respond, sharp and furious. "That is an outrageous lie," Duchess Constance said, sweeping into the room with her skirts snapping around her, her face flushed with what Elena could not tell was genuine anger or the desperate performance of someone caught in her own scheme. "I have never spoken to this man in my life. He is clearly attempting to shift blame away from his own dishonest work by inventing a connection to my name." Fairweather, cornered now, and clearly unwilling to bear the full weight of the scandal alone, turned toward her, with something like desperation in his eyes. "Your Grace," he said, "forgive me, but I have the letter you sent, requesting my services, and outlining exactly what you wished me to suggest about Miss Whitmore's character. I kept it, in case such a moment as this ever arose." The room fell utterly silent. Constance's face, which had been flushed with fury only moments before, drained of color entirely, and for the first time since Elena had met her, the Duchess appeared genuinely, visibly afraid. "Produce this letter," the Duke said, his voice deadly quiet now, quieter than Elena had heard it at any point since the ball, and somehow more frightening for its restraint. Fairweather reached into his coat with trembling hands and withdrew a folded piece of paper, offering it to the Duke, who took it and unfolded it slowly, reading in silence, while every eye in the room remained fixed on his face. When he finally looked up, his expression had hardened into something Elena had not yet seen from him, cold and unyielding. "This is your handwriting," he said, addressing Constance directly, "and your seal. You commissioned this man to fabricate a scandal that would destroy an innocent woman's reputation, purely because she received attention you believed belonged to you alone." "I did what was necessary," Constance said, her voice rising now, the careful composure she had maintained for years, finally beginning to crumble, "to protect this family's name from an entanglement that would have humiliated us all. You cannot possibly intend to marry a seamstress's daughter, Alistair. The very idea is absurd, and I refuse to stand by silently while you destroyed generations of standing over a passing infatuation. You mistake protecting this family's name for protecting your own ambitions," the Duke said coldly. "I have never once encouraged the hopes you nursed regarding myself, Constance, and I will not allow you to justify cruelty and deception by dressing them up as concern for a family name you have done far more to damage today than Miss Whitmore ever could have, simply by existing." The room remained frozen in stunned silence as the full weight of what had just occurred settled over the gathered guests. Elena stood beside the Duke, her heart pounding, watching as the woman who had commanded her to lower herself to the floor days before now stood exposed and humiliated in front of the very witnesses she had once hoped would judge Elena instead. "You will leave this house by morning," the Duke said finally, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "I will not have someone under my roof who has demonstrated such willingness to destroy an innocent person's reputation for the sake of her own ambitions. Whatever explanation you offer your husband for this departure is your own concern, but you will not remain here another night." Constance opened her mouth as though to argue further, then seemed to think better of it, perhaps recognizing, at last, that the room full of witnesses who had gathered to hear scandal about Elena had instead witnessed her own downfall, and that further argument would only deepen the humiliation already settling over her. She turned and swept from the room without another word, her earlier confidence replaced by something brittle and hollow, and the guests who remained watched her go, with expressions that mixed shock, satisfaction, and, in a few cases, something almost like pity. Fairweather, sensing correctly that his own position had become precarious, mumbled something about urgent business elsewhere, and slipped from the room shortly after, leaving the Duke and Elena standing together amid the stunned silence of the remaining guests. The truth finally laid bare after days of whispered rumor and careful scheming. "I am sorry you had to witness that," the Duke said quietly, once most of the guests had begun to disperse. murmuring among themselves as they processed what they had just seen. "Do not apologize," Elena said, though her hands were still trembling slightly from the tension of the confrontation. "I would rather stand here and watch the truth come out, however uncomfortable, than spend another moment wondering what lies were being whispered about me in rooms I could not enter." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something like admiration mixing with the lingering anger still visible in his expression. "You are remarkable," he said quietly. "Most people, faced with what you face today, would have crumbled or fled. You stood your ground and demanded the truth for yourself, rather than waiting for someone else to demand it on your behalf." "I have spent my whole life being underestimated," Elena said simply. "I have grown rather practiced at refusing to let that underestimation become my undoing." Around them, the drawing room slowly emptied, the shocked guests carrying word of what they had witnessed out into the wider world, where it would spread, this time, as the truth, rather than as scandal. Elena did not yet know what the coming days would bring, what consequences Constance might face for her scheme, or what her own future now held. But standing there in the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, she felt something settle firmly within her chest, a certainty that whatever came next, she would face it standing tall, exactly as she had learned to stand in the days since a duke had lifted her from the floor and refused to let her be broken. News of Duchess Constance's scheme spread through the county with the same speed the earlier rumors had, but this time the story carried the weight of truth rather than idle speculation, and Elena found, to her quiet astonishment, that the same people who had whispered behind their fans days before now greeted her with something closer to respect. She did not trust this shift entirely, aware that public opinion could turn as quickly as it had turned against her, but she allowed herself, cautiously, to breathe a little easier, for the first time since the night of the ball. Constance departed Ashcombe Manor the following morning, exactly as the Duke had commanded, though not without a final confrontation that Elena witnessed only from a distance, standing near an upstairs window as a carriage was loaded with trunks, while the Duchess argued quietly but fiercely with her husband, Lord Edmund Ravenswood, who had arrived the previous evening upon hearing word of the scandal. Elena could not hear their words, but she could see, even from a distance, the tension in Lord Edmund's posture, the way he kept his distance from his wife, as though her presence had become something he could no longer bear to stand near. Lady Margaret, who joined Elena at the window, offered what explanation she could. "Edmund is a proud man," she said, "but not a cruel one, unlike his wife. I imagine he is deeply humiliated by what she has done, and equally uncertain what it means for his own standing within the family. He and Alistair have always been close, despite Constance's ambitions, and I suspect this will strain that friendship considerably, regardless of how the rest plays out." "Will she face any true consequence?" Elena asked, watching the carriage finally pull away down the long drive, disappearing beyond the hedges that lined the estate's boundary. "Or will she simply retreat somewhere else and begin planning again?" "That, my dear, is a question none of us can answer with certainty," Lady Margaret admitted. "Constance has always been resourceful, and pride wounded as badly as hers was yesterday does not simply fade away. I would advise you to remain watchful, even now that the immediate danger has passed. But for today, at least, you may allow yourself some measure of peace." Elena tried to take her advice, though peace proved harder to hold on to than she expected. Over the following days, she found herself increasingly drawn into the rhythms of life at Ashcombe Manor, invited by Lady Margaret to return for tea, then for a walk through the gardens, then for a quiet dinner, attended only by the Duke, his aunt, and a handful of trusted family friends. Each visit deepened her understanding of the world she had stumbled into weeks before, a world of careful alliances and quiet expectations, where every gesture carried meaning far beyond its surface. The Duke, for his part, made no secret of his growing affection, though he was careful, in public settings, to maintain a respectful distance that would not invite further scandal. In private moments, walking together through the manor's extensive gardens, or sitting quietly in the same drawing room where Lady Margaret had first offered Elena tea, his warmth toward her grew steadily more evident, expressed not through grand declarations, but through small, consistent kindnesses that Elena found more convincing than any elaborate speech could have been. "You have grown quieter these last few days," he observed one afternoon, as they walked together along a gravel path lined with late-blooming roses. the autumn air carrying the first real chill of the changing season. I hope the events of the past week have not left you more troubled than you let on. I am simply thinking, Elena admitted, about how quickly everything has changed. 3 weeks ago I was a seamstress's daughter with no expectation of ever setting foot inside a house like this one. Now I walk these gardens as though I belong here, though I am not entirely certain that I do. You belong wherever you choose to belong, the Duke said firmly, stopping to face her directly, his expression earnest in a way that made Elena's breath catch slightly. I have watched you stand your ground against a duchess determined to break you, against a man paid to destroy your reputation with lies, and against an entire ballroom of strangers who judged you before they knew a single true thing about your character. If that is not belonging, Elena, I do not know what the word means. Elena felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words, though a familiar caution held her back from responding as freely as she might have wished. There is still a great deal I do not understand about this world, she said carefully. I do not know how to navigate the expectations placed on someone of your position, and I fear that even with Constance gone, there will be others who look at me and see only a seamstress's daughter who does not belong among people of rank. There will always be people like that, the Duke admitted honestly. I cannot promise you a world free of judgment or cruelty, Elena. What I can promise is that I will stand beside you against it, exactly as I have from the moment you helped me on that road without ever asking what I could offer you in return. You showed me kindness when you had every reason to walk past a stranger and continue on your way. I intend to spend a great deal of time showing you, in return, that such kindness was never wasted. They stood together in the quiet garden, the afternoon light slanting golden through the trees, and for a long moment neither spoke, the weight of unspoken feeling settling comfortably between them, rather than demanding immediate resolution. Elena thought of her mother, waiting patiently at home for updates on a courtship neither of them had ever imagined possible, and she thought too of Charlotte Bennet, whose brave warning had likely saved her from a scandal that might have proven impossible to overcome. She thought of Lady Margaret's steady kindness, of the strange, winding path that had led her from a muddy road outside Hollow Bridge to this quiet garden, standing beside a man who looked at her as though she were the most remarkable person he had ever encountered. I do not know what the future holds, she said finally, breaking the comfortable silence between them. But I find, standing here, that I am no longer afraid to discover it. Neither am I, the Duke said softly, and for the first time since the night of the ball, Elena allowed herself to believe, fully and without reservation, that whatever storms still waited on the horizon, she would not face them alone. But even as that quiet certainty settled over her, a letter was already making its way toward Ashcombe Manor, from a source neither Elena nor the Duke had yet considered, carrying news that would test the fragile peace they had only just begun to build. The letter arrived on a gray morning, nearly 2 weeks after Constance's departure, delivered not by a servant of Ashcombe Manor, but by a messenger from London, bearing a seal Elena did not recognize, but which caused Lady Margaret's face to pale the moment she saw it in the steward's hands. That is the seal of the Whitcomb family, Lady Margaret said quietly, taking the letter with hands that trembled slightly. Alistair's mother's people. I did not expect to hear from them, not after all these years of careful silence. Who are the Whitcombs? Elena asked, watching Lady Margaret's expression with growing unease. I have not heard the Duke mention that name before. They are a complicated part of this family's history, Lady Margaret said carefully, breaking the seal and unfolding the letter with visible reluctance. Alistair's mother came from a family of considerable influence in London, and when she passed away many years ago, certain arrangements were made regarding Alistair's inheritance and his eventual marriage that were never formally set aside, merely left unspoken, because no immediate need arose to address them. Elena felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. What kind of arrangements? She asked, though some instinct already warned her of the answer, before Lady Margaret spoke it aloud. Lady Margaret finished reading the letter in silence, her expression growing increasingly troubled, before finally looking up to meet Elena's worried gaze. It seems Alistair's mother, before her death, arranged a betrothal contract between her son and a young woman of the Whitcomb family, intended to secure certain financial and political alliances between the two families. Alistair was a child at the time, far too young to have any say in the matter, and the arrangement was largely forgotten as the years passed, and both families moved in different directions. But it appears the Whitcomb family has not forgotten, and word of the scandal involving Constance's scheme against you has apparently reached London, prompting them to formally invoke the contract before it can be quietly set aside any longer. Elena felt the floor seem to shift slightly beneath her feet. They wish him to marry someone else, she said slowly, forcing the words out despite the tightness in her throat. Someone chosen for him as a child, based on an agreement he never consented to as an adult. That is precisely the situation, Lady Margaret confirmed grimly. And I am afraid, given the legal weight such contracts carried in his mother's family, that this will not be a matter easily dismissed, however much Alistair may wish it to be. They found the Duke in his study, poring over estate documents with the steward, and the moment he saw Lady Margaret's expression and the letter clutched in her hand, he rose immediately, his own face growing pale as he read the contents. Elena watched him carefully as he processed the news, searching his expression for any sign of what this revelation might mean, and found instead a mixture of anger and disbelief that gave her some small measure of reassurance. "This is absurd," he said finally, setting the letter down with more force than necessary. "I was 7 years old when this arrangement was made. I have not seen or spoken to Margaret Whitcomb, the woman named in this contract, since we were children. I certainly never agreed to honor an arrangement made entirely without my knowledge or consent." Legally, Lady Margaret said carefully, such contracts, when properly drafted and witnessed, can carry significant weight, particularly when substantial financial arrangements were tied to their fulfillment. I do not say this to frighten either of you, but I would be doing you both a disservice if I pretended this could simply be dismissed without consequence. "What consequence do they threaten?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already understood the answer. "The letter mentions a considerable sum," Lady Margaret said, glancing again at the paper in her hand, "tied to certain properties your mother's family controls, properties that would revert to Whitcomb ownership should the contracted marriage fail to take place. There is also mention, though phrased carefully, of pursuing the matter through legal channels should you refuse to honor the arrangement, which would create precisely the kind of public scandal this family has only just begun recovering from." The Duke's jaw tightened visibly. "They mean to force my hand through threat of scandal, exactly as Constance attempted," he said bitterly. "I will not be bullied into abandoning someone I care for simply because a contract drafted for a child's future by people long dead demands it." Elena, who had remained largely silent through this exchange, finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "this is a decision you should make with full knowledge of what it might cost you, rather than in anger at being cornered. I do not wish to be the reason your family loses properties or faces further scandal, not after everything Constance already put you through." The Duke turned to her immediately, his expression softening despite the tension still visible in his shoulders. "Elena," he said firmly, "I did not stand against my own cousin's cruelty, simply to abandon you now, because a piece of paper drafted when I was a child demands it. Whatever this contract claims, I will find a way to address it honestly, without sacrificing what I have found with you, to satisfy an arrangement neither of us ever agreed to." Lady Margaret cleared her throat gently, drawing their attention back to more practical matters. "I would suggest, before either of you commit to any particular course of action, that we consult with the family's solicitor regarding the actual legal standing of this contract. Such arrangements, however seriously worded, are not always as binding as the parties invoking them wish to claim, particularly when so many years have passed without any attempt at enforcement." "That seems wise," the Duke agreed, though the tension had not fully left his expression. "I will send for Mr. Aldridge today. In the meantime, Elena, I do not want you to carry the weight of this alone. Whatever comes of this contract, know that my feelings toward you remain entirely unchanged." Elena nodded, though the uncertainty of the situation weighed heavily on her despite his reassurance. She thought of how quickly their fragile peace had been disrupted, how easily the world seemed determined to find new obstacles between them, just as the old ones had finally been cleared away. She wondered whether this was simply the nature of a life spent among people of rank and fortune, an endless series of contracts and expectations that had little to do with genuine feeling and everything to do with power carefully maintained across generations. Over the following days, the household fell into a tense, watchful rhythm as Mr. Aldridge, the family's longtime solicitor, arrived to review the contract in detail, poring over the original document, alongside more recent correspondence from the Whitcomb family's own legal representatives. Elena found herself largely excluded from these discussions, not deliberately, but simply because the legal complexities involved fell outside anything she had knowledge or standing to address, and the waiting proved almost harder than the earlier confrontation with Constance had been, precisely because there was no clear villain to confront, no single moment of dramatic reckoning, only the slow, grinding uncertainty of legal proceedings that seemed to stretch on without resolution. It was Lady Margaret who finally brought news, nearly a week after the contract's arrival, finding Elena in the garden where she had taken to walking each morning, to clear her mind of the anxious thoughts that circled endlessly whenever she remained idle indoors. "Mr. Aldridge has completed his review," Lady Margaret said, settling onto the bench beside Elena, with the careful deliberateness of someone about to deliver news of significant weight. "The contract, while genuine, contains a critical flaw. Alistair's mother, in her haste to secure the arrangement before her health declined further, failed to obtain the signature of Alistair's father, who held equal authority over such matters, according to the family's own legal traditions. Without that second signature, the contract has no binding legal force whatsoever, regardless of what the Whitcomb family's solicitors may claim." Relief flooded through Elena so suddenly that she felt momentarily lightheaded. "Does this mean the matter is resolved?" she asked, hardly daring to believe it. "It means Alistair cannot be legally compelled to honor the arrangement," Lady Margaret confirmed. "Whether the Whitcomb family chooses to pursue the matter further through public scandal rather than legal action remains to be seen, but Mr. Aldridge believes, given the weakness of their legal position, they will likely choose to withdraw quietly rather than risk further embarrassment by pressing a claim they cannot ultimately win." Elena closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself, finally, to feel the full weight of relief that had been held at bay through days of anxious waiting. "Thank you," she said softly, "for bringing me this news yourself. I wanted you to hear it as soon as possible," Lady Margaret said, patting her hand gently. "I know these past weeks have tested you in ways no young woman should reasonably be expected to endure, but I have watched you meet each test with more grace and courage than most people twice your age could manage, and I confess, Elena, that I have grown rather fond of you these past weeks, quite apart from whatever my nephew feels." Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, moved by the older woman's quiet kindness. "Thank you," she managed, "for everything. I do not know how I would have navigated any of this without your guidance." "You would have managed," Lady Margaret said with a small, knowing smile, "precisely because you are the sort of person who manages, regardless of the obstacles placed in your path. But I am glad, nonetheless, that you did not have to face this particular obstacle entirely alone." As the two women sat together in the quiet garden, the morning sun finally breaking through the earlier clouds, Elena allowed herself to believe, for the first time in days, that the storm surrounding the Whitcomb contract had truly passed. She did not yet know that within Ashcombe Manor's walls, the Duke was already composing a careful letter to the Whitcomb family, one intended not merely to dismiss their claim, but to close the matter permanently, in a way that would leave no room for future attempts to revive an arrangement neither he nor Elena had ever wanted honored. The Whitcomb family, as Mr. Aldridge had predicted, chose not to pursue their claim once informed of the contract's legal weakness, and within a fortnight, a brief, coolly worded letter arrived, acknowledging that the matter would not be pursued further, though the tone made clear that the family's pride had been wounded by the outcome. Elena felt the last of her lingering anxiety finally ease when the Duke shared the letter with her, reading it aloud, in the same quiet drawing room where their acquaintance had first deepened weeks before. "It is finished, then," Elena said, hardly able to believe the words as she spoke them. "This particular matter is finished," the Duke agreed, folding the letter carefully and setting it aside. "Though I suspect, given everything we have already faced together, that it will not be the last obstacle either of us encounters. I find, strangely, that I am no longer troubled by that possibility. Facing difficulty alongside you seems infinitely preferable to facing an easy life without you." Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, though a familiar caution still lingered, born of weeks spent navigating a world of scheming duchesses and forgotten betrothal contracts. "There is still so much I do not know about this life," she admitted. "I do not know how to manage a household of this size, or how to navigate the endless social obligations that come with your position. or how to respond when people whisper, as they inevitably will, that I have somehow schemed my way into a fortune I was never meant to have. You will learn what you need to learn, the Duke said gently, exactly as you have learned everything else these past weeks, through courage and patience and a refusal to let other people's expectations define your worth. And as for the whispers, Elena, they will fade in time, as all gossip eventually does, replaced by whatever new scandal catches the county's attention next. I have far more confidence in your ability to weather that storm than I do in most people born into this life who have never once had to prove their own strength. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Margaret, who entered the drawing room with an expression that mixed amusement and exasperation in equal measure. I have just received word, she announced, that half the county intends to attend a gathering at the Pemberton estate next week, ostensibly to celebrate the harvest season, though I suspect the true purpose is simply to observe the two of you together and satisfy their curiosity about the state of your acquaintance following recent events. Elena felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect of facing another large social gathering so soon after the turmoil of the past weeks, though she recognized, too, that avoiding society entirely would only fuel further speculation rather than quiet it. "Do you think we should attend?" she asked, glancing toward the Duke. "I think," he said carefully, "that the decision should be entirely yours, Elena. I will not ask you to face another room full of curious strangers before you feel ready, regardless of what the county expects or assumes." Elena considered the question seriously, weighing her own lingering anxiety against the practical reality that she could not spend the rest of her life avoiding social gatherings simply because the last one had ended in cruelty. She thought of how far she had come since that night, how the trembling girl who had nearly touched her knee to the ballroom floor had since stood her ground against a hired liar and weathered the threat of a forgotten betrothal contract without breaking. She found, turning the question over in her mind, that she was no longer quite so afraid of what a room full of strangers might think of her. "I would like to attend," she said finally, surprising herself slightly with the certainty in her own voice. "I have spent enough time these past weeks being spoken about in rooms I could not enter. I would rather walk into this one myself and let people see for themselves who I actually am, rather than whatever version of me their imaginations have constructed." The Duke's expression warmed with obvious pride at her answer, and Lady Margaret, watching the exchange, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. "Then we shall attend together," the Duke said, "and this time, I promise you, there will be no ambiguity whatsoever about where I stand, nor any doubt left in anyone's mind regarding my intentions toward you." The days leading up to the Pemberton gathering passed in a flurry of preparation, and Elena found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, growing increasingly comfortable within the rhythms of Ashcombe Manor, spending long afternoons with Lady Margaret, learning the particular customs and expectations that governed the social world she was gradually being welcomed into, not as an outsider tolerated for the Duke's sake, but as someone whose opinions and company Lady Margaret had genuinely come to value in her own right. Charlotte Bennet, whose warning weeks before had likely saved Elena from a scandal that might have proven impossible to overcome, had since left Constance's household entirely, unwilling to continue serving a woman whose cruelty she had witnessed and ultimately helped expose. At Lady Margaret's suggestion, and with Elena's enthusiastic support, Charlotte was offered a position within the Ashcombe household itself, a decision that pleased Elena greatly, both for the chance to repay Charlotte's courage and for the simple pleasure of having a genuine friend nearby amid the sometimes overwhelming grandeur of her new circumstances. "I still cannot quite believe how quickly everything has changed," Elena confided to Charlotte one afternoon, as the two young women walked together through the manor's gardens, the autumn leaves crunching softly beneath their feet. "Weeks ago I was pinning hems in Mrs. Hargrove's shop, certain my life would continue along exactly the same quiet path it had always followed. Now I am preparing to attend a gathering where half the county will be watching to see whether a duke intends to marry me." Charlotte laughed softly, linking her arm through Elena's. "I confess I find it rather wonderful, watching you navigate all of this. You have not changed at all, you know, despite everything. You are still the same woman who helped a stranger on a muddy road without asking what he could offer you in return. You have simply found yourself in circumstances grand enough to let the rest of the world finally notice what was always true about your character." Elena squeezed Charlotte's arm gratefully, moved by the simple honesty of her friend's words. "I could not have survived these past weeks without you," she said sincerely. "Your warning saved me from a scandal that might have destroyed everything before it had the chance to begin." "I only did what any decent person would have done," Charlotte said, though her cheeks colored slightly at the praise. "I am simply grateful I found the courage to act on it, rather than remaining silent out of fear for my own position." As the day of the Pemberton gathering finally arrived, Elena dressed carefully in a gown Lady Margaret had commissioned specifically for the occasion, a deep green silk that Elena's own skilled hands had helped alter to fit her perfectly. A small but meaningful detail that reminded her, even as she prepared to enter a world of wealth and rank far beyond her origins, that the skills she had learned as a seamstress's daughter remained genuinely her own, not something to be hidden or forgotten simply because her circumstances had changed. Standing before the mirror in her chambers, studying her own reflection in the deep green silk, Elena felt a steadiness settle over her that had been entirely absent on the night of the ball weeks before. She was no longer the trembling girl who had nearly touched her knee to a ballroom floor rather than risk further humiliation. She was a woman who had faced down a scheming duchess, weathered the threat of a forgotten betrothal contract, and found, through it all, a growing confidence in her own worth that no amount of whispered gossip could easily unravel. When the Duke arrived to escort her to the carriage, his expression, upon seeing her, carried an admiration so open and genuine that Elena felt any remaining nervousness dissolve entirely beneath its warmth. "You look remarkable," he said simply, offering his arm. "I feel remarkable," Elena admitted, taking his arm with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "Whatever awaits us at the Pemberton estate tonight, I find I am ready to face it, standing exactly where I choose to stand." "Then let us go and show the county precisely who you are," the Duke said, and together they stepped out into the cool autumn evening, ready to face whatever curious eyes and whispered speculation awaited them, no longer as a duke and a stranger whose acquaintance invited only scandal, but as two people who had weathered genuine storms together and emerged, on the other side, more certain of one another than either had been when the season first began. The Pemberton estate glowed with lantern light when their carriage finally arrived, the grounds already crowded with guests who had traveled from every corner of the county to attend what had been advertised as a simple harvest celebration, though Elena understood, as clearly as everyone else present, that curiosity about her acquaintance with the Duke was the true draw for many of those gathered. She felt the familiar flutter of nervousness return as they stepped from the carriage, but this time it settled quickly into something steadier, something closer to determination. She thought of Charlotte's words in the garden, that she had not changed at all despite the grandeur of her new circumstances, and she carried that thought with her like armor as they made their way toward the brightly lit entrance where their host, Lord Pemberton, waited to greet them personally. "Your Grace," Lord Pemberton said warmly, extending his hand, "and Miss Whitmore, I am delighted you both chose to attend this evening. I confess I have heard a great deal about recent events at Ashcombe Manor, and I must say, having now heard the full truth of the matter from several reliable sources, I find myself deeply impressed by the courage you demonstrated, Miss Whitmore, in the face of such deliberate cruelty." Elena felt a warm flush of surprise at his open kindness, so different from the whispered speculation she had braced herself to encounter. "Thank you, my lord," she said sincerely. "I confess, I expected a rather different reception this evening." "You will find," Lord Pemberton said with a knowing smile, glancing briefly toward the Duke, "that most reasonable people in this county have little patience for the kind of scheming Duchess Constance attempted. Word of her disgrace has spread rather thoroughly these past weeks, and I believe you will find tonight's gathering considerably more welcoming than you might have feared." His words proved accurate as the evening progressed, and Elena found herself, again and again, greeted not with the cold curiosity she had braced for, but with genuine warmth from guests, eager to make her acquaintance properly, many of them openly admiring the courage she had shown in standing against both Constance's public cruelty and Fairweather's fabricated scandal. She recognized several faces from the earlier ball, women who had watched in silence as Constance commanded her to lower herself to the floor, and though she felt a flicker of old resentment at the memory, she found, speaking with them now, that many seemed genuinely regretful for their earlier silence, eager now to make amends through open kindness. "I owe you an apology," one woman said quietly, drawing Elena aside during a lull in the evening's dancing. Lady Farnsworth, if I recall correctly, though Elena had met so many new faces that evening that she could not be entirely certain. I stood in that ballroom weeks ago and said nothing while the Duchess humiliated you. I told myself it was not my place to interfere in another woman's business, but in truth, I was simply afraid of drawing her anger toward myself instead. I have thought of that evening often since, and I am ashamed of my own silence. Elena studied the woman's earnest expression and felt her earlier resentment soften into something more forgiving. I understand fear, she said gently. I do not blame anyone for choosing silence when speaking out might have cost them dearly. What matters to me now is simply moving forward, rather than dwelling on what was said or left unsaid on a single difficult evening. Lady Farnsworth's expression eased with visible relief. You are more gracious than I deserve, she said. I hope, in time, we might become genuine friends, rather than simply acquaintances bound together by an awkward memory. I would like that very much, Elena said sincerely, and found, as the words left her mouth, that she meant them entirely. As the evening wore on, the Duke remained close beside her, though he made no effort to shield her from conversation or attention, trusting, as Elena had come to trust herself, that she was fully capable of navigating whatever curiosity or warmth the evening's guests offered. It was during a quiet moment near the edge of the dance floor, as the orchestra paused between songs, that Lord Pemberton approached again, this time accompanied by an older gentleman Elena did not immediately recognize. Miss Whitmore, Lord Pemberton said, allow me to introduce Sir Nathaniel Ashworth, a longtime friend of the Duke's family, and, I believe, someone with particular insight into matters of estate and inheritance that may interest you both. Sir Nathaniel, a distinguished man with kind eyes and a weathered face that suggested decades of careful diplomatic work, bowed politely before addressing them both. I have followed the recent events at Ashcombe Manor with great interest, he said, and I confess, I find myself deeply moved by Miss Whitmore's resilience throughout what must have been an exceedingly difficult season. I wonder, Your Grace, whether you have given thought to how best to formalize your intentions, given how thoroughly the county's attention has already fixed itself upon this particular acquaintance. The Duke glanced at Elena before responding, a silent question passing between them, that Elena answered with a small, encouraging nod, curious herself to hear what Sir Nathaniel might suggest. I have given the matter considerable thought, the Duke admitted, though I confess the recent complications with the Whitcomb contract gave me pause, wanting to ensure any formal announcement I make carries no risk of further legal entanglement. Sir Nathaniel nodded knowingly. A wise caution, given recent circumstances. I would simply observe, having watched this county's opinion shift so dramatically over these past weeks, from scandal to something approaching genuine admiration, that further delay may serve only to invite renewed speculation rather than settle it. Sometimes, Your Grace, the clearest way to silence uncertain whispers is with certain truth, spoken plainly and without further hesitation. The Duke considered this advice carefully, his gaze drifting toward Elena, with an expression that carried both tenderness and something like quiet resolve. Elena felt her heart quicken beneath his gaze, understanding, without needing the words spoken aloud, exactly what thought was forming behind his careful consideration. Perhaps, he said slowly, still holding her gaze, Sir Nathaniel's advice deserves serious consideration. Elena, might I have a moment to speak with you privately, away from the crowd? She nodded, her pulse racing, and allowed him to guide her away from the bright lights and music of the main gathering, out through a set of glass doors onto a quiet stone terrace overlooking the Pemberton estate's darkened gardens, where the sound of the orchestra faded into a distant, pleasant murmur behind them. I have been thinking, the Duke began, his voice carrying a nervousness Elena had rarely heard from him before, about everything we have weathered together these past weeks. Constance's cruelty, Fairweather's lies, the sudden reappearance of a forgotten contract that nearly separated us before we had the chance to fully understand what we meant to one another. Through all of it, Elena, I have found myself growing more certain, not less, that whatever storms life continues to send our way, I would rather face them standing beside you than face an easier life without you at all. Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, moved by the earnest vulnerability in his voice. so different from the commanding authority she had first witnessed the night he lifted her from the ballroom floor. "I feel exactly the same," she said softly. "I did not come to this season expecting anything beyond a single evening I could remember fondly for years to come. Instead, I found someone who saw my worth clearly from the very first moment we met, long before either of us understood what that meeting would come to mean." The Duke reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. His hands, Elena noticed with tender surprise, trembling slightly as he opened it, to reveal a simple but elegant ring, far less ostentatious than she might have expected from a man of his position, and somehow more meaningful for its restraint. "Elena Whitmore," he said, his voice steady now despite the earlier tremor in his hands. "I do not offer you a title, or a fortune, as the reason to accept this ring, though both will certainly accompany it. I offer you instead my genuine admiration for your courage, my respect for your character, and my complete certainty that whatever life we build together, it will be built on the same honest foundation as the kindness you showed a stranger on a muddy road, weeks before either of us understood what that kindness would grow to become. Will you marry me?" Elena felt the weight of the entire evening, the entire season, settle into this single moment, and found, as she looked into his earnest, hopeful expression, that her answer had never truly been in doubt, not since the moment he had crossed a crowded ballroom to lift her from her knees and silence an entire room in her defense. "Yes," she said, her voice steady and sure, despite the tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "Yes, I will marry you." The Duke slipped the ring onto her finger with careful, reverent hands, and when he drew her into an embrace, Elena felt, for the first time since that fateful night weeks before, that every storm they had weathered together had led them, inevitably and rightly, to exactly this moment. Standing together beneath the quiet stars of the Pemberton estate, no longer a duke and a stranger whose acquaintance invited scandal, but two people who had proven, through every difficulty placed before them, that genuine devotion could withstand cruelty, deception, and even the weight of forgotten contracts, emerging on the other side stronger and more certain than either had imagined possible when the season first began. News of the engagement spread through the county within days, though this time the whispers that followed carried none of the cruelty that had once threatened to unravel everything Elena and the Duke had built together. Instead, the story that traveled from household to household was one of genuine admiration, of a Duke who had chosen character over convention, and a seamstress's daughter who had proven, time and again, that her worth had never depended on the circumstances of her birth. Elena's mother wept with joy when she received the news, holding her daughter close in the small rooms above Mrs. Hargrove's shop, where Elena had spent so many quiet years, stitching hems for other women's grand occasions, never once imagining she might someday be preparing for an occasion entirely her own. "I always knew you were destined for more than this shop could offer you," her mother said softly, "though I confess I never imagined it would come in quite this form." "Neither did I," Elena admitted, smiling through her own tears. "But I would not trade a single moment of the life we built here, Mother. Everything I learned in this shop, patience, skill, the value of honest work, has served me well in every room I have entered since." The wedding preparations that followed occupied the entire household at Ashcombe Manor for weeks, and Elena found herself, throughout the process, leaning heavily on the steady friendship of both Lady Margaret and Charlotte, who had become, in the months since her arrival, as close and trusted as any friend she had known throughout her earlier life. Lady Margaret took particular pleasure in guiding Elena through the endless details of a grand wedding, though she was careful, always, to defer to Elena's own preferences, rather than imposing tradition, simply for tradition's sake. "You need not have every element of this wedding follow convention," Lady Margaret reminded her one afternoon, as they reviewed guest lists and floral arrangements in the same drawing room where Elena had first taken tea weeks before, feeling utterly out of place among such grandeur. "This is your wedding, Elena, and Alistair's. It should reflect who you both genuinely are, not simply what tradition dictates a duke's wedding must look like." Elena took that advice to heart, and the final ceremony, when it finally arrived on a crisp autumn morning, carried touches that reflected her own history, as clearly as it honored the Duke's position. The gown she wore, though grand and beautifully made, incorporated lace she had stitched herself in the quiet evenings leading up to the ceremony, a detail known only to herself and her mother, a small private acknowledgement of the skilled hands that had carried her from a modest dressmaker's shop to this remarkable day. The chapel at Ashcombe Manor, filled with guests from every corner of the county. Many of them faces Elena now recognized warmly, rather than fearfully, transformed over the preceding months from curious strangers into genuine friends and allies. Lord Pemberton attended with his family, along with Sir Nathaniel Ashworth, whose gentle advice on the terrace that autumn evening had helped hasten a proposal Elena now understood had always been inevitable. Even Lord Edmund Ravenswood attended, alone, his marriage to Constance quietly dissolved in the months since her disgrace, his presence a small but meaningful gesture of reconciliation between two branches of the family that had nearly been torn apart by his former wife's cruel ambitions. Of Constance herself, there had been no word since her departure months before, though rumors occasionally reached Ashcombe Manor of a woman matching her description living quietly in a distant county, her fortune considerably diminished, her reputation permanently tarnished by the scandal she herself had set in motion. Elena felt no particular satisfaction in these rumors, only a quiet relief that the woman's schemes had finally, fully run their course, no longer capable of threatening the happiness Elena had fought so hard to build and protect. As Elena walked down the chapel aisle on her mother's arm, having chosen, deliberately, to forego the tradition of being given away by any male relative she did not possess, she felt none of the trembling uncertainty that had gripped her the night of that first fateful ball. She walked instead, with the same steady confidence she had learned to carry through every storm since, her back straight, her chin lifted, no longer the girl who had nearly touched her knee to a ballroom floor, rather than risk further humiliation, but a woman who had proven, beyond any doubt, that her worth had never required anyone else's permission to exist. The Duke waited for her at the altar, his expression carrying the same open admiration she had first glimpsed on the Pemberton terrace when he asked her to marry him, and as she reached his side and took his offered hand, Elena felt the final, lingering weight of every difficult moment since that first ball finally lift entirely from her shoulders, replaced by a certainty as solid and steady as the stone walls of the chapel around them. "We are gathered here today," the officiating clergyman began, "to witness the joining of two people whose acquaintance began, I am told, on a muddy road outside Hollow Bridge, through nothing more than simple kindness, offered without expectation of reward." A soft ripple of warm laughter moved through the gathered guests, and Elena caught the Duke's eye, sharing a private smile at the simple truth of how their remarkable story had actually begun, far removed from the grandeur of ballrooms and titles, rooted instead in something far more genuine and enduring. As the ceremony continued, Elena found her mind drifting briefly back through the whole remarkable journey that had led her to this moment. The terror of that first curtsy commanded lower and lower before a watching crowd, the warmth of Lady Margaret's first kindness, the desperate courage Charlotte had shown in delivering her warning, the cold fear of Fairweather's fabricated scandal, the anxious uncertainty of the Whitcomb contract, and finally, the quiet, steady joy of standing here now, surrounded by people who had come to know and value her, not for her birth, but for the character she had shown, through every difficulty placed in her path. She thought, too, of Duchess Constance, wherever she now resided, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt no lingering bitterness toward the woman whose cruelty had set this entire remarkable journey in motion. Without that command to lower herself further and further toward the ballroom floor, without the Duke's swift and unwavering intervention, Elena might never have discovered the depths of her own courage, might never have learned how firmly she could stand against injustice when it mattered most. When the ceremony concluded, and the Duke drew her into a gentle, tender kiss before the assembled guests, Elena felt the full weight of everything she had endured finally settle into something whole and complete. A story that had begun with cruelty, but had transformed, through courage and honesty and unwavering devotion, into something far more powerful than any single act of humiliation could have destroyed. Later that evening, as the wedding celebration continued beneath strings of warm lantern light in the Manor's grand ballroom, the very same room where Constance had once commanded her to lower herself to the floor, Elena found herself standing near the same spot where that terrible moment had unfolded months before. But the room felt entirely different now, filled with warmth and celebration rather than cruelty and judgment, and Elena understood, standing there with her husband's hand clasped firmly in her own, that she had not simply survived that terrible night months before, but had transformed its memory entirely, reclaiming the very space where she had once been humiliated, and making it, instead, the setting for the happiest celebration of her life. "Do you remember?" the Duke murmured softly beside her, watching the same guests who had once gathered here in judgment, now dancing joyfully in celebration of their union, standing in almost this exact spot, the night everything began to change. "I remember every moment of it," Elena said softly, leaning into him with quiet contentment. "The fear, the humiliation, and then your hand closing around mine, lifting me back to my feet before I ever touched the floor." "I would do it again in an instant," the Duke said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "I would cross 1,000 crowded rooms, face 1,000 scheming duchesses, weather 1,000 forgotten contracts, for the chance to stand here with you now, exactly as we are." As the music swelled around them, and their guests continued their joyful celebration late into the night, Elena Whitmore, now Duchess of Ashcombe, allowed herself, finally and completely, to simply be present in the happiness she had fought so hard and so long to claim. She had entered that grand ballroom months before, as a stranger commanded to lower herself before a room of judging eyes. She left it now, and would return to it countless times in the years to come, as a woman who had proven, beyond any doubt, its true worth could never be measured by a curtsy's depth, but only by the strength and grace with which a person rose again, every single time, no matter how far they had been pushed down. And in the years that followed, whenever new guests arrived at Ashcombe Manor and heard the story whispered among the older families of the county, of a duchess who had once been commanded to lower herself before an entire room, only to be lifted to her feet by a duke who silenced every voice of cruelty in that space, they understood, without needing further explanation, exactly what kind of household they had entered, one built not on the rigid customs of rank and birth, but on the enduring, unshakable truth that genuine character always, eventually, finds the recognition and respect it has earned.